Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Woman in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary Shirley, and today I'm pleased to shine a light on Wendy Wysong. Wendy is an example of the impact that someone can have on you, and many years can pass and the impression still remains. Wendy and I have never met, but when I was not long an expat living in Singapore, I attended a conference and Wendy was speaking on the panel. I don't much remember what she was talking about that day, probably something to do with FCPA updates because I was voraciously interested in those. But I do remember thinking, wow, this woman's got chops. She's very impressive. And years later, as I was putting together my agenda for upcoming podcasts, I remembered Wendy and I knew that I wanted to have her on our show. So Wendy, I hope that comes as somewhat of a compliment to you that you left a wonderful mark. And I'd like to welcome you to the show and ask you to tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Mary. I had no idea I'd made an impression. Usually I talk at those conferences and I feel, like I'm making a bond in the moment and then it goes. But that was one of my favorite things, though, was to be able to just travel to Singapore and talk with folks who are interested in compliance, travel all around the region. I'm based in Hong Kong. I've been here for about, well over 10 years. Switched a couple different law firms, but doing the same thing that I truly love is helping companies understand what the law is and how to comply. And when mistakes are made, helping represent and defend them and their actions before the U.S. government.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And so I guess many of our listeners, we have a very large American base, are stateside. So what's it been like being based in Hong Kong during the pandemic?
Well, you have to remember, we had to adapt to COVID and remote working a lot earlier than the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. We were early adapters of conference calls, masks were on immediately. But the pandemic impact has really gone on a lot longer than the rest of the world, and it's very harsh. We can't travel easily, not because other countries don't want us to travel, but because when we come back, we have a 3-week mandatory quarantine on our return. So it's very difficult for us to travel to other countries, to be able to really build the practice and talk the way that we used to. And meet face to face. So everything we do has to be planned ahead very, very carefully, every part of every investigation, every visit. And so, I'm trying to make sure that we can accommodate other people's schedules and build in that 3-week quarantine.
And I think investigations was one area where a lot of compliance professionals immediately panicked when we went into lockdowns, thinking, how are we going to conduct our investigations remotely? So I'm curious to know, what adaptions have you made to conducting investigations with less ability to travel?
Well, I mean, the obvious one is, you can't conduct them on site. And so, and I've tried to look at how we typically go through step by step. Every investigation has, routine steps that you want to follow, and it's what the government, when they're looking at your internal investigation, it's what they expect to see. And it's funny because all of us have done, exactly the same thing, where since you can't go on site, you can't go and actually physically collect documents. We've worked with all of the forensic companies to make sure that they've absolutely adapted their methodologies to get documents, and upload them electronically. But the two wrinkles are that one of the main things we used to do was get laptops, and get phones and copy those. Well, you don't know where those laptops and phones are because they're not in the offices anymore. and, tracking down people in some very remote areas that have they're working remotely, they're nomads, and finding them and finding, a forensic company that can adapt to that and show up on some beach and grab somebody's laptop and get a copy. That was one kind of funny thing that we had to think through very carefully, and explaining, that they still were obligated to do that. The other thing is interviews and conducting them. And now we have checklists, and making sure that when you talk to folks, you can't really build the rapport that you used to when you're doing an interview. So you have to figure out ways to make them feel comfortable. You have to look very carefully at the surroundings that the person is doing the interview in, because some people can come into the office, but others, we're interviewing them in their homes or in a remote location. You have to wonder about who else is there. Is it secure? Can we preserve confidentiality? Are they comfortable? How are we going to get a translator there if we need a translator there? Making sure the equipment works, and doing all the run-throughs, because, here it is 2 years past, and I can't tell you how many times we have to say, you're on mute, that kind of thing. That still is just a standard phrase. So, I guess, for me, the hardest part is just not being able to really take visual clues from people the way that you can when you're face to face. You can't show documents. We've got to all be experts on sharing our screen and going through and highlighting documents like that. You don't want to send the documents, to the witness ahead of time. Anyway, so it's all these things. And then I tell folks that, just add 2 months to every estimate of how long it's going to take, because you can't just show up and just call people up into the office. You have to arrange for folks to be there. So, and then have like plan B, plan C, plan D. Hopefully you don't get to that, on how you do everything. So I guess that's just planning and then planning again.
So reassurance to our audience members who are conducting investigations: if you find that you're going over your usual average in terms of duration and length, don't be too worried. That's kind of normal right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So 2021, when I was preparing the outline for you and we were having our preliminary discussions, at the time, I prepared a question for you, which was about how quiet 2021 has been compared with 2020 with respect to compliance program and FCPA guidance coming out of the US government. And then since we were talking, there has been the Deputy Attorney General Monaco discussion at the ABA White Collar Crime Conference. So I wondered if I could get you to opine on some of the interesting stuff that you thought came out of that. I know for me, I paid particular attention to monitorships being emphasized. Frequent flyers should start to get nervous, and probably rightly so. It's not a good look to have multiple issues going on across the years. So not a huge surprise that that's in there, a removal of the default presumption of no monitorships. But I think you found some other areas of interest, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I don't want to say same old, but I think every time they go through sort of a lull in enforcement, particularly in FCPA enforcement, right out of the box, the first thing that they say at the conferences is we're putting more resources into it. I think this year the phrase was there's a surge of resources that are going to the FCPA, they're going to export controls and sanctions. We're going to see an increase in enforcement. And, whether or not that really bears out, I think remains to be seen. But I guess for me, one thing, that has happened because of the pandemic and because there's been this lull which I think is largely because, it's difficult to, on the other side, when I was a prosecutor, it's very difficult to do remote investigations. If we think it's hard on our side, it's doubly hard in government. So there's been this lull, and I've told companies, use this lull. This is not, the time to, just put your compliance concerns aside, because it's very much a situation where if you're not doing your regular compliance checks, if you're not doing monitoring, if you're not trying to figure out where the problems might arise, because all your employees are working remotely, you're losing an opportunity. My kids always talk about how I'm railing them against procrastination. I know I'm saying, we got to make sure that you don't procrastinate. And I say the same thing, use the time wisely, when there is a lull. And you'll really get the benefit of that later on when that surge of resources actually comes to fruition.
Perfect. That makes sense. And so essentially you're saying, don't slack off, everyone. This is not an opportunity to lay back. Is there anything else that you think compliance officers should be focusing on right now with respect to bolstering their compliance programs and staying up to date with FCPA best practices?
Sure. And I do think, again, it's because of the pandemic. There's this lack of oversight, supervision, monitoring, a lack of guidance. You can't do the face-to-face FCPA training. Employees are more autonomous. And then there's just all this stress. People are worried about losing their jobs. That the company is going to go under. There's a disconnect from the workplace. There's all this perfect storm of compliance issues. And prosecutors and regulators, they're not going to give you a pass if you say, we were doing the best we can, because they're going to hold the companies accountable. And so I think, the two primary areas, and it's not going to come as any surprise, is because there's been all this stress to build up your businesses during the pandemic, new business partners, the suppliers that you haven't worked with before, the customers that you haven't dealt with before, you're trying to woo them, in order to save your business. Are you cutting corners? Are your employees cutting corners? Are they looking away from your compliance program for a second and saying, I really need to think about how I can get this particular piece of business. And so I think that, again, the due diligence requirements, looking at those, reminding your employees, what the rules are in terms of, compensating commissions, fees, and thinking about engaging third-party researchers, to really check out who these people, these new folks are that you're doing business. And then I guess the other area is, the government funding that's been provided, and making sure that if your company got some of that COVID funding, that didn't get diverted for other purposes, and looking at that. So again, it's just not time to cut compliance resources, and if your CEO is looking, ways to cut money, cut funding and money, compliance isn't where it should be cut at this point.
I'm sure many compliance officers will agree with you there. So one of the great things about working in private practice and consultancy is you get to see a wide range of compliance programs of all of your different clients. For those who are taking your advice and not being complacent and in fact using this as an opportunity perhaps to trailblaze, what's something innovative that you've been seeing a client do with their compliance program recently?
So, it's I don't get to go on site, which is a bummer. One of my favorite things that I will always remember is I went to it was a Japanese company, and they had these amazing anime cartoons everywhere. around their shredder, around their copier, in the coffee room. That, I don't read Japanese, but as I was looking at it, you could figure out what exactly was going on in the picture. And they were so cute and they were so perfect that's a great innovation. And the compliance manager hadn't told me that she was doing it. I wouldn't have known about it had I not been on site. But I thought it was such a great way of building in, in a non-threatening kind of way. And it was, a friendly, culturally appropriate kind of way. I thought that was great. I've seen a lot of folks introduce a compliance minute in their Zoom calls, where I'm there as a guest speaker, and they'll start the call, and whereas before they might have a safety minute, now they'll have a compliance minute, which I thought was very. I love that. And then I've seen, again, companies that are aware of sort of the ebb and flow of investigations and enforcement. I've seen companies use this sort of delay and this kind of breather where they don't have, the regulators sending out a million subpoenas. I've seen them use that time to conduct a gap analysis, to do a refresh of their compliance programs, because they've got a second to actually take a moment to do that. And then again, having the announcements from, the senior managers, tone from the top, again, as a crawler along the line of emails and things like that. So I don't know. I mean, folks are doing the best that they can, and I think that having a moment to kind of think about how they want the compliance program to work, and so that's been nice to see.
Good. Well, just a sub question of the gap analysis. There are a few different ways in which you can perform gap analysis, and I'm curious to understand, are you seeing them do it on their own? Are they engaging third parties to help them do reviews? How are they identifying those gaps at the moment?
So, I mean, when I see it, it's usually because they've asked us to just take a quick look, and they want to, there's either been a regulatory change that they want to make sure has been incorporated in, throughout their compliance program if there's a need, or if they want to make sure that their program is up to market. And since we see every industry,
right,
and we're very familiar with the industry, we can compare and say, well, most companies don't necessarily have, a very complicated table of, the gifts and hospitality that are allowed. They'll have, general suggestions. Or, in your particular country, this is, market as they want to know. CEO can spend this much, the line employee can spend this much. It depends on what event it is, and so they want very detailed, and that's market practice. And so if you want to be level with market, most companies would like to be level with market. They don't necessarily want to be the leader, and they certainly don't want to be below market. And so that's the kind of analysis that we do, and making sure that, the company's compliance programs are going to withstand scrutiny. Once the regulators get going, obviously effective compliance programs are a huge benefit to the company, both in preventing the violations and then obviously at the end of the day, mitigating any potential penalties. Most of the agencies will give some credit for that.
Wonderful. So great benchmarking knowledge that you have to help out there. And my final question for you, Wendy, is, have new data privacy requirements changed the way you think about doing business recently?
Yeah, and putting aside COVID and putting aside the pandemic, the laws that have been put in place recently on data privacy across the globe are going to be with us for a long time. And those are ones that are going to be very important and to understand how they're going to impact you. And there's many different permutations across the world. One good thing is the GDPR prepared all of us for that, and the data restrictions in the EU. One that we are dealing regularly with now is China. And China has had very strict and cascading restrictions that they have been building up for years. I mean, we've dealt with the state secrets laws, we've dealt with cybersecurity, data security, and now we have a privacy law that was just recently introduced, the Personal Information Protection Law, which was designed after the GDPR, that really looks after individual privacy and focusing on intrusions, commercial intrusions on individuals' privacies. And so you're having to take all of those into account when you do an investigation and making sure that you've got the capacity and the capability and that you're thinking through how are you going to conduct that, in China when you can't travel to China right now. Hopefully by the mid-December, we're hearing that there's going to be travel between Hong Kong and China. But, making sure that you've got the resources to do those investigations and those document reviews in China on site, and that you've complied with all of the different laws in order to be able to bring any of the documents, witnesses, interviews, whatever it is, where you need to respond to any internal investigation or an external regulatory investigation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wendy. You are as impressive now as you were a decade ago, and very grateful to have your knowledge shared with us, and all the best for the remainder of the year. Take good care.
Thank you, Mary. It's been a pleasure. Nice to see you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.